Herod was not afraid of a baby. He was afraid of everything that baby represented to a throne he had bled, betrayed, and murdered to keep. And the moment he heard the word king spoken by strangers from the east, he understood exactly what kind of danger he was facing, and it was not superstition. To understand what happened at Bethlehem, you have to understand what kind of man sat on that throne, because the version most people inherit is a cartoon, a wicked king in a story about angels. And that version cannot survive contact with the historical record. Herod was not born to rule Judea. He was Idumean, descended from a people the Hasmonean kings had forcibly converted a century earlier, which meant that to the Jewish population he governed, he was never fully one of them, no matter how many titles Rome gave him, and Rome had given him plenty. The Senate had named him King of the Jews decades before any child was born in a stable, a title he had to fight a war to actually collect, clawing his way into Jerusalem with Roman legions at his back while the people inside the walls saw him as exactly what he was. An outsider installed by a foreign empire to keep the province quiet and the tax revenue flowing. That arrangement was not stable, and Herod knew it better than anyone. Client kingship in the Roman world was a leash, not a crown. He ruled at the emperor's pleasure, which meant his entire life was a performance of usefulness. Massive building projects to prove his loyalty, a rebuilt temple to buy Jewish goodwill he never fully earned, informants woven through every level of his court because he could never be certain who was still loyal and who was waiting for him to fall. And beneath all of it sat the one thing no amount of Roman favor could manufacture: legitimacy. He was not descended from David. He had no ancestral claim to the throne he occupied, only a Roman appointment and an army, and everyone around him knew it, which meant every rumor of a true claimant was not gossip. It was a countdown. This is the man who had already executed his own wife. Mariamne, the Hasmonean princess he married partly to borrow the legitimacy her bloodline carried, was put to death on his orders after years of paranoid suspicion. Her mother followed. Two of his own sons, Alexander and Aristobulus, were strangled on his command years later, executed for the crime of being popular, of being seen by the public as more legitimate heirs than their father had ever been. A third son, Antipater, was killed days before Herod's own death. This was not a man occasionally driven to violence. This was a governing method. By the time 3 foreign travelers arrived asking an open question in his own court, Herod had spent decades demonstrating in blood exactly what he did to anyone who threatened his position. And he did not distinguish between a grown rival and one still in the cradle. So when the Magi came to Jerusalem, and it matters that they came to Jerusalem first, to the palace, the seat of power, because that is where you'd expect a king to be found. The words they used were not poetic. They asked where the one-born king of the Jews could be found. Present tense. Born, not appointed, not crowned by Rome. In a court obsessed with the fragility of its own legitimacy, that phrase alone was an act of political detonation. Matthew's account says Herod was troubled and all Jerusalem with him, and that single detail is worth sitting with. The fear rippled outward immediately because everyone in that city understood what a genuine Davidic claimant would mean for the current arrangement. Herod's response was not panic, it was procedure. He assembled the chief priests and scribes, the men who held the actual religious authority he lacked, and asked them plainly where the Messiah was supposed to be born. They answered from the prophets. Bethlehem in Judea, a town whose only real significance was that it was David's town, the origin point of the entire royal bloodline Herod had spent his life trying to borrow and could never actually possess. The scholars gave him the location without hesitation. What they didn't know, or perhaps didn't ask, was what he intended to do with it. If you want the version of these stories that survives contact with the historical record, subscribe. The next one uncovers a betrayal inside Herod's own household that even his biographers struggle to explain. What Herod did next reveals the calculation underneath the fear. He didn't send soldiers immediately. He called the Magi to a private meeting, extracted from them the exact time the star had appeared, and then sent them onward to Bethlehem with instructions dressed in false piety. Find the child, then report back to me, so that I too may go and worship him. It was a lie built with surgical precision, designed to turn unwitting foreign travelers into intelligence gatherers. For an execution he had already decided to carry out. He needed a location he didn't yet have, and until he had it, every day that child remained findable was a day the threat stayed alive. But the Magi never returned. And that silence, stretching on with no report, no location, no confirmation, would have been unbearable to a ruler who had built his entire survival on knowing where every threat stood at all times. Warned in a dream, Matthew tells us they went home by another route, leaving Herod with nothing but the fragment of information the priests had already given him. Bethlehem, a town of perhaps a few hundred families, small enough that a targeted purge was logistically possible, symbolically loaded enough that it demanded one. What followed was not chaos, it was policy. Herod calculated the age range from the timing the Magi had given him and ordered the killing of every male child in Bethlehem and its surrounding region 2 years old and under. A decision engineered for certainty, wide enough in scope to guarantee the specific child could not slip through it. There is no surviving Roman record of the massacre outside Matthew's account, and the scale was almost certainly small by the standards of a small town, not the vast slaughter later art would imagine. But scale was never the point. For families in Bethlehem, there was no abstraction in it. There was a soldier at the door, a child taken, and a grief that history would compress into a single verse while they lived inside it as the defining catastrophe of their lives. Weeping in Ramah, the text calls it, borrowing the words of the prophet Jeremiah. Mothers refusing to be comforted because their children were gone. This is the part the familiar retelling softens into folklore, and it deserves to be said plainly. Herod's fear was never irrational. It was the fear of a man who understood power with total clarity. That the one currency he could never counterfeit was legitimate bloodline, and that a child born in David's town, spoken of as a king by outsiders with no political stake in flattering him, represented the single threat that bribes, exile, and even execution might arrive too late to stop. His entire family history had already proven what he would do when faced with exactly that fear. This was not Herod breaking character. This was Herod fully and finally being who he had always been. What history remembers as a quiet birth in an obscure town was, to the men who actually held power in Judea that winter, the most dangerous political event of their reign. And somewhere between those two truths, in the space no gospel or history book can fully close, Bethlehem's families paid the price for a king's arithmetic of fear.